In the previous lesson, we created a boilerplate for our test and even set up a test database for all our future end-to-end tests. In this lesson, let's focus on adding real logic to all of our to-do end-to-end tests and ensure that our CRUD coffees routes work as intended. But before we get started, let's focus on the before all hook here. As we know already, the create nest application method is used to instantiate a full nest runtime environment. You could think of it as an instance of the application that we have in our main TS file. This means that any configuration that was added outside of modules themselves, so basically anything that was done in our main TS file, must be added and applied here as well, unless it's not needed for this particular end-to-end test. For this reason, we need to make sure we bind the validation pipe we have set up here. So let's copy this and paste it over in our end-to-end spec file. Perfect. With that in place, we should be ready to get started testing our endpoints. Let's start off with the create post endpoint. First, let's remove the .todo suffix and add a missing callback function instead. Now, we can use the supertest library, which we've used already to perform an HTTP request to our application. Before we proceed though, let's first define a sample coffee that we can use for all of our other endpoint tests as well. Let's scroll to the beginning of the describe block and add a coffee variable with some key values that belong to our entity like name, brand, and flavors. With this in place, let's head back to the create endpoint test and add the following logic. In the body of the request, we must send an object that fulfills the createCoffeeDTO class. Note we've added as createCoffeeDTO for better type safety here as well. The test here is currently simple and only expects an HTTP status of created from the API call. But if we needed to test the return value more specifically, we could test it by looking at the value returned back from the promise, like so. If you're not familiar with Jasmine, it's another testing framework that Jest is actually based on. We can't dive deep into Jasmine here, but just know that there are a lot of other great helper and utility methods available to you from Jasmine when creating your tests. In the code shown here, we're using Jasmine helpers for partial matching. This is useful when an expectation only cares about certain key value pairs when performing the actual test. In addition, we needed to transform flavors, which are an array of strings, to objects since each flavor is an entity in our application. Alternatively, we could just create a separate file with expected static responses and DTOs to avoid putting too much repetitive logic like this in our end-to-end tests. But with all of this in place, let's fire up our terminal and run our end-to-end tests now. As we can see, the test was successful. As an exercise, try to implement all of the other to-do tests in this file to get a better feel for end-to-end testing yourself. If you're stuck at any point and unsure of how to continue, just scroll down and view all of the completed test code below. So as we've seen in this testing chapter, Nest.js module system allows us to test each feature independently. Isolating specific features makes it easier to develop and maintain tests simply, effectively, and quickly. With the testing fundamentals we went through here, you're now ready to tackle any testing scenario you might run into in your future Nest applications.